heat of the Georgia summer clung to Whitmore Plantation like a suffocating shroud. Even as the clock tower in the big house chimed midnight, the cotton fields stretched endlessly under the pale moonlight, their white boles swaying gently in the humid breeze that offered little relief from the day's scorching temperatures. In the slave quarters, a collection of ramshackle wooden cabins that housed nearly 200 souls, most had long since fallen into the exhausted sleep that came after 18-hour workdays under the merciless sun. But for the fifth consecutive night, sleep eluded many in the quarters, and the reason stood at the very edge of their small community, his weathered form silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Old Blue, a mangy mongrel with patchy brown and grey fur and eyes clouded by age, stood rigid as a statue, his muzzle pointed toward the abandoned shack that sat like a festering wound on the plantation's eastern border. His barks cut through the night air with an urgency that made even the bravest souls pull their thin blankets closer to their chins. "Lord have mercy," whispered Mama Sarah from her pallet in the cabin she shared with 6 other women. Her voice, weathered by 60 years of hard living, carried the weight of someone who had seen too much in her lifetime. "That dog gonna bring the devil himself down on us all if he don't hush." But Old Blue wouldn't hush. If anything, his barks grew more frantic as the night wore on, more desperate, as if he were trying to warn them of something terrible approaching, something that only he could see or sense. Etta Washington sat up on her straw mattress, her dark eyes fixed on the dog's silhouette through the gaps in the cabin's wooden walls. At 18, she was considered one of the prettier girls in the quarters, with smooth dark skin, intelligent eyes, and hands that, despite years of picking cotton, still retained a certain grace. But it wasn't her beauty that set her apart. It was the way she seemed to notice things others missed, the way animals gravitated toward her, and the unsettling accuracy of her intuitions about people and events. "Etta, child, you best lay back down," Mama Sarah called softly. "Ain't nothing good gonna come from paying attention to that dog's carrying on." But Etta couldn't ignore it. There was something different about Old Blue's behavior, something that made her stomach twist with an unease she couldn't name. The dog had belonged to Master Whitmore's daughter, Miss Caroline, before she died of yellow fever 3 years ago. Since then, he'd wandered the plantation like a lost soul, usually quiet and withdrawn, seeking scraps and shelter wherever he could find them. The slaves had taken pity on him, sharing what little food they could spare, and in return Old Blue had become something of a guardian for the quarters. He'd bark warnings when the overseer approached unexpectedly, had once saved little Samuel from a copperhead that had slithered too close to the children's play area, and seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense when someone was falling ill before they showed symptoms. But for 5 nights now, he'd stood in that exact spot, roughly 50 yards from the nearest cabin, at the point where the packed earth of the quarters gave way to the wild grass and weeds that surrounded the abandoned shack. His barks weren't the sharp, aggressive sounds he made when warning of danger, nor the excited yips he gave when begging for food. These were different, mournful almost, but with an underlying desperation that seemed almost human in its intensity. "What you see out there, old boy?" Etta whispered, rising quietly from her bed and padding barefoot to the cabin's single window. The abandoned shack had been empty for as long as anyone could remember, at least 20 years, according to the older slaves. Some said it used to house field hands before the new quarters were built closer to the main plantation buildings. Others whispered darker stories, speaking in hushed tones about things that had happened there during the early days of the plantation, back when old Master Whitmore's father had run things with an iron fist that made his son's cruelties seem almost gentle by comparison. Those stories varied depending on who was telling them, but they all shared certain common elements: disappearances, strange rituals, and an atmosphere of dread that had eventually forced the abandonment of the structure. Most of the slaves avoided the area entirely, crossing themselves and muttering prayers if their work took them anywhere near it. As Etta watched, Old Blue's barking ceased abruptly. He turned to look directly at her window, and even from this distance, she could swear she saw intelligence in those clouded eyes, and something else. Fear? Recognition? It was impossible to tell, but the dog's gaze seemed to bore into her soul, as if he were trying to communicate something of vital importance. Then, as suddenly as he had stopped, Old Blue resumed his barking, but now it seemed directed specifically at her. He would bark 3 times, pause, look toward her window, then repeat the pattern. It was almost as if he were calling to her, trying to get her attention for a specific purpose. "You want me to follow you, don't you?" she asked quietly, though she knew he couldn't hear her from this distance. As if in response to her words, Old Blue's tail gave a single hesitant wag before he returned to his urgent barking. Etta glanced around the cabin at her sleeping companions. Mama Sarah had finally drifted off, her snores mixing with those of the other women. Young Mary clutched her 3-month-old baby to her chest, both mother and child exhausted from the day's labors. In the corner, old Aunt Celia, not to be confused with the mysterious woman some claim to have seen wandering the plantation at night, muttered in her sleep, probably reliving some long-ago trauma. These women were her family in every way that mattered. They had raised her after her mother died in childbirth, had protected her from the worst of the overseer's attention, had shared their meager rations when she was too sick to work. The thought of bringing danger to them made her stomach clench with guilt. But the thought of ignoring whatever Old Blue was trying to tell her felt even worse. Etta had always been different from the other slaves, though she'd learned early to hide her peculiarities. She could sense things, emotions, illnesses, sometimes even events before they happened. When she was 12, she'd woken up screaming about fire 3 hours before lightning struck the tobacco barn. When she was 15, she'd known that Master Whitmore was planning to sell the Johnson family 2 days before he announced it, giving them time to say proper goodbyes and hide what few precious possessions they had. The other slaves called it the sight, and while they respected it, they also feared it. Having the sight meant being different, and being different on a plantation was dangerous. It drew attention, and attention from white folks was rarely good. But Old Blue's behavior was triggering every instinct she had. Something was wrong. Not just wrong, but catastrophically wrong. And whatever it was connected to that abandoned shack. Etta made her decision with the same quiet determination that had helped her survive 18 years of slavery. She would follow Old Blue and see what had him so agitated. If it was nothing, she'd return to her bed and try to forget about it. If it was something dangerous, she'd warn the others. She just prayed she wouldn't regret it. Moving with the practiced silence of someone who had learned early that being heard at the wrong time could mean a beating, or worse, Etta slipped from her pallet and gathered her few possessions. Her dress was little more than rough burlap held together with careful stitching, but it was clean and mended. Her feet were bare, as always. Shoes were a luxury reserved for house slaves and the occasional field hand who had earned special favor. The cabin door creaked softly as she opened it, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet night. She paused, listening for any sign that she'd woken someone, but the gentle chorus of snores continued undisturbed. Outside, the night air was thick with humidity and the scent of magnolia blossoms from the trees that lined the path to the big house. Crickets chirped in the tall grass, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called mournfully. It was the kind of peaceful summer night that, under other circumstances, might have been beautiful. But as Etta stepped into the moonlight, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The very air seemed charged with tension, as if the world itself were holding its breath in anticipation of something momentous. Old Blue saw her immediately and stopped barking. He stood perfectly still for a moment, his clouded eyes fixed on her face, and Etta could swear she saw relief in his expression. Then he turned and began walking slowly toward the abandoned shack, pausing every few steps to look back and make sure she was following. "I'm coming, old boy," she whispered, "but you better not be leading me into trouble." The walk to the shack felt like crossing into another world. With each step, the familiar sounds of the plantation, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of cotton plants in the breeze, even the soft snores from the quarters, faded behind them. The packed earth beneath her feet gave way to wild grass that tickled her ankles, and the carefully maintained order of the plantation dissolved into the chaotic tangle of nature reclaiming abandoned land. As they approached the structure, Etta could see why it had been abandoned. The shack leaned precariously to one side, its wooden walls weathered to a silvery gray and split by years of Georgia storms. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, and several boards had fallen away entirely, leaving gaps like missing teeth in a skull's grin. Weeds grew tall around its foundation, and Spanish moss draped from the nearby oak trees like funeral shrouds, creating an atmosphere of decay and neglect that made her skin crawl. But it was the smell that truly unsettled her. Even from 20 feet away, she could detect the unmistakable odor of rot and decay. mixed with something else, something that reminded her of the root cellar where Mama Sarah stored her herbs and remedies, but darker, more pungent, tinged with a metallic scent that made her think of blood. Old Blue stopped about 10 feet from the door and whined, his body language shifting from determined to reluctant. He looked up at Etta, as if asking her to reconsider. But when she continued forward, he followed with obvious reluctance, his tail tucked between his legs. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, and Etta had to push aside a curtain of spider webs to reach it. Her hand trembled as she grasped the rotted wood, and for a moment she hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to go back to the safety of the quarters, to pretend she'd never seen Old Blue's strange behavior. But something else, curiosity perhaps, or a deeper compulsion she couldn't name, drove her forward. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, then pushed. The door groaned open with a sound like a dying animal, and moonlight spilled through the doorway, illuminating a scene that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The interior of the shack was larger than it appeared from outside, though that might have been a trick of the shadows. Broken pottery littered the floor, and what remained of crude wooden furniture sat collapsed and rotting in the corners. But it was what lay in the center of the room that made Etta's breath catch in her throat and her heart hammer against her ribs. A bundle of dark cloth sat on the floor, roughly the size and shape of a newborn baby. The fabric looked ancient, older than anything she'd ever seen, and it seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it, creating a pool of absolute darkness in the center of the room. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she could swear the bundle was moving slightly, rising and falling as if something inside it was breathing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the smell. That metallic rotting odor was much stronger here, mixed with something else that made her gag. And there, barely visible in the moonlight, she could see dark stains covering the floor around the bundle, stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Old Blue whined again, pressing against her legs. His fur was standing on end, and she could feel him trembling. But he didn't try to lead her away. Instead, he seemed to be offering what comfort and support he could, as if he understood that she needed to see this, needed to understand what they were dealing with. As Etta stared at the bundle, fragments of half-remembered conversations began to surface in her mind. Stories told in whispers when the white folks weren't around, tales of the early days of the plantation when old Master Whitmore's father had ruled with a cruelty that bordered on madness. Stories of slaves who had disappeared in the night, of strange rituals performed in secret, of things that should have stayed buried. She'd always assumed those stories were just that, stories told to frighten children or pass the time during long winter nights. But looking at the bundle now, feeling the wrongness that radiated from it like heat from a forge, she began to wonder if there might be more truth to those tales than anyone wanted to admit. The bundle pulsed again, more noticeably this time, and Etta could swear she heard something. A whisper so faint it might have been the wind, but it sounded almost like her name. Etta. She took a step backward, her heart racing, but found her path blocked by Old Blue. The dog was no longer trembling. Instead, he stood firm and solid behind her, as if he were trying to keep her from running away. "What is that thing?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was asking Old Blue or herself. As if in response to her voice, the bundle pulsed again, stronger this time, and the whisper came again, clearer now. "Etta, help me." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but something that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of human speech. It was the voice of something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to find it, someone to hear its call. And despite every instinct screaming at her to run, despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her, Etta found herself taking a step closer to the bundle, because whatever was in there, it knew her name, and it was calling to her. The voice came again, soft as a summer breeze but carrying an undertone of desperate longing that made Etta's heart ache with unexpected sympathy. "Etta, please, I've been waiting so long." Against every rational thought in her head, she found herself drawn forward, her bare feet moving across the blood-stained floorboards as if guided by some invisible force. The bundle seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, and with each step, the whispers grew clearer, more distinct. "Help me, child, I'm trapped, so cold, I'm so alone." Old Blue whined behind her, but he didn't try to stop her approach. Instead, he followed at a distance, his clouded eyes never leaving the bundle, his body tense with the kind of alertness that came from sensing predators. As Etta drew closer, she could see that the bundle was wrapped in what looked like burlap, but the material was so old and stained it was difficult to tell. The fabric was bound with rope that appeared to be made from some kind of plant fiber, tied in knots that formed a deliberate pattern, a design that seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd seen it before. The dark stains on the floor weren't just around the bundle. They formed symbols and patterns that extended outward in all directions, creating a complex design that covered nearly the entire floor of the shack. Some of the symbols looked like letters or numbers, but others were completely foreign, resembling nothing she'd ever seen in the few books she'd glimpsed in the big house. "What happened to you?" she whispered, kneeling down just outside the circle of stained symbols. The bundle pulsed again, and suddenly Etta's mind was flooded with images, not her own memories, but something else, something that felt like it was being projected directly into her consciousness. She saw the shack as it had been decades ago, clean and well-maintained, with proper furniture and oil lamps casting warm light on the walls. She saw a man, tall, pale, with the kind of cold eyes that suggested cruelty was as natural to him as breathing. He was dressed in expensive clothes that marked him as wealthy, and he moved with the arrogant confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. This had to be old Master Whitmore's father, the man whose reputation for brutality had become legend among the slaves. But in these visions, he wasn't alone. There were others with him, men and women dressed in dark robes, their faces hidden by hoods, their movements ritualistic and purposeful. And there, in the center of the room where the bundle now lay, was a young slave girl, no older than Etta herself. She was bound to a wooden table, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth gagged to prevent her from screaming. The robed figures moved around her in a circle, chanting in a language that hurt to hear, while the man who would become Master Whitmore's father stood over her with a knife that gleamed with more than just reflected light. "No," Etta gasped, trying to pull away from the visions, but they held her fast, forcing her to witness horrors that no human should ever see. The knife descended, and the girl's life force seemed to flow out of her in visible streams of light, drawn into a small object that one of the robed figures held above her body. The object, Etta couldn't quite make out what it was, pulsed with each heartbeat, growing brighter and more substantial as it fed on the girl's essence. But something went wrong. The ritual, whatever its intended purpose, spiraled out of control. The object began to pulse erratically, and the streams of light that had been flowing into it suddenly reversed direction, pouring back out in a torrent of raw, chaotic energy. The robed figures screamed and scattered as the energy lashed out at them, but it was too late. The thing they had created or summoned or awakened was beyond their control now. It fed on their terror, their pain, their life force, growing stronger with each passing moment. The visions shifted, showing her glimpses of the aftermath. Bodies drained of life, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute horror. The shack abandoned in haste, left to rot and decay as nature slowly reclaimed it. And at the center of it all, the object, whatever it was, wrapped in cloth and bound with rope, its hunger temporarily sated, but never truly satisfied. "They tried to use me," the voice whispered as the visions faded. "Tried to bind a spirit to their will to create a weapon they could control. But I was stronger than they expected. I broke free, but not completely. The bindings they placed on me, they still hold. I cannot escape this place, cannot find peace." Etta blinked, finding herself back in the present, kneeling on the blood-stained floor with tears streaming down her cheeks. The bundle lay before her, still pulsing gently, and she could feel the entity's attention focused on her like a physical weight. "You can see the truth," the voice continued, and now it sounded almost pleased. "You have the sight, don't you, child? You can perceive what others cannot." "What are you?" Etta asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am what remains of those who died here," the entity replied. "Their pain, their fear, their desperate desire for justice. I am vengeance given form, retribution made manifest, and I have been waiting so very long for someone who could hear my call." Old Blue barked sharply, the sound cutting through the entity's seductive whispers like a knife. The dog moved closer to Etta, pressing against her side, and she could feel his warmth and solidity anchoring her to the physical world. "The dog knows," the entity said, and there was amusement in its voice now. "Animals can sense what I truly am. But you, child, you can choose to see me as I wish to be seen." "And how is that?" Etta asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. "As justice," the entity replied, "as the instrument of righteous vengeance against those who have caused so much suffering. Do you know how many of your people have died on this plantation, Etta? How many have been beaten, tortured, murdered? How many children have been sold away from their families, never to be seen again?" Images flashed through her mind. Not visions this time, but memories. Her own memories of the cruelties she'd witnessed, the injustices she'd endured, the friends and family members who had suffered and died under the plantation system. She saw Overseer Briggs raising his whip to strike down anyone who dared to show the slightest defiance. She saw Master Whitmore selling children at auction, separating families with the casual indifference of someone disposing of livestock. She saw the endless days of backbreaking labor under the scorching sun, the meager rations that left everyone constantly hungry, the cramped quarters where disease spread like wildfire. "I could end it all," the entity whispered. "I could make them pay for every cruelty, every injustice, every moment of suffering they've caused. All you have to do is free me from these bindings." The offer was tempting, more tempting than Etta wanted to admit. The idea of seeing Master Whitmore and Overseer Briggs face justice for their crimes, of watching the plantation system that had caused so much pain finally crumble, filled her with a fierce satisfaction. But Old Blue barked again, more urgently this time, and when she looked down at him, she saw something in his clouded eyes that gave her pause. It wasn't just fear, it was warning. The dog was trying to tell her something, trying to make her understand that things weren't as simple as the entity was making them seem. "What would happen to the other slaves?" she asked. "The innocent people who live here?" "They would be free," the entity replied, without hesitation. "Free from bondage, free from suffering, free from the pain of existence itself." There was something in the way it said "free" that made Etta's blood run cold. She thought of little Samuel, who always saved her a piece of his cornbread when he could. She thought of Mary's baby, who had just learned to smile. She thought of Mama Sarah, who had raised her with love and kindness, despite the harsh circumstances of their lives. "Free how?" she pressed. The entity's silence was answer enough. "You would kill them," Etta said, understanding flooding through her. "You would kill everyone. I would end their suffering," the entity corrected. "Death is not the worst fate that can befall a slave child. I would give them peace." "That's not your choice to make," Etta said firmly, rising to her feet and taking a step back from the bundle. The entity's presence seemed to darken, and the temperature in the shack dropped noticeably. "You would condemn them to continue living in bondage? You would allow their suffering to continue indefinitely?" "I would give them the chance to find their own freedom," Etta replied. "The chance to live, to love, to hope for something better." "Hope?" The entity's laughter was like breaking glass. "What hope do slaves have? What future awaits them but more of the same?" But even as the entity spoke, Etta could feel something stirring in the spiritual currents around her, a sense of change coming, of great events approaching that would reshape the world. She couldn't see the details clearly, but she could sense that the future held possibilities the entity couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. "Things are going to change," she said with growing conviction. "I can feel it. The world is going to be different. And you think that change will come without blood, without suffering?" the entity snarled. "You think freedom will be handed to your people on a silver platter?" "Maybe not," Etta admitted, "but that's still better than the emptiness you're offering." The bundle pulsed violently, and the symbols on the floor began to glow with a sickly light. The entity's rage was palpable now, filling the shack with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. "You disappoint me, child," it said, and its voice had lost all pretense of kindness. "I had hoped you would be wiser than your ancestors." "My ancestors?" Etta asked, confused. "Oh yes," the entity said, and now its voice was filled with malicious glee. "Did you think you were the first to find me? The first to hear my call? Your bloodline has been drawn to this place for generations, child, and each time they have made the same foolish choice you're making now." The air in the shack began to shimmer, and suddenly Etta could see them, ghostly figures standing around the edges of the room, watching her with expressions of infinite sadness. She recognized some of them from old stories and faded daguerreotypes, her great-grandmother Casey, her grandmother Rabena, others whose names had been lost to time but whose faces bore the unmistakable stamp of family resemblance. They all came here, the entity continued, all drawn by the same gift that brought you, the ability to see beyond the veil, to perceive the spiritual realm, and all of them chose to bind me rather than free me, to perpetuate the suffering rather than end it. They were protecting people, Etta said, understanding beginning to dawn. They were fools, the entity spat, and now you have the chance to correct their mistake. Free me, child, and I will show you power beyond your wildest dreams. I will make you a queen among your people, a force of nature that no white man would dare to oppose. The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and threat. Etta could feel the entity's power pressing against her mind, showing her visions of herself wielding supernatural abilities, commanding respect and fear from those who had once oppressed her. But she could also feel the presence of her ancestors, their silent encouragement, giving her strength. They had faced this same choice, this same temptation, and they had chosen to protect rather than destroy. No, she said firmly, I won't free you. The entity's shriek of rage was so loud, it seemed to shake the very foundations of the shack. The bundle writhed and twisted, straining against its bindings, and for a moment Etta thought the ropes might snap, but they held, and gradually the entity's fury subsided into something colder and more calculating. Very well, it said finally. But know this, child, I am patient. I have waited decades for freedom, and I can wait decades more. And when the bindings finally weaken, when age and time take their toll on the protections your ancestors placed on me, I will remember your choice. I will remember your defiance. And when I am finally free, you and all your descendants will be the first to feel my wrath. The threat hung in the air like a physical presence, but Etta stood her ground. She had made her choice, and she would live with the consequences. Come on, Old Blue, she said, turning toward the door. We're leaving. But as she reached the threshold, the entity spoke one last time, its voice following her into the night. You cannot run from your destiny, child. The blood calls to blood, and sooner or later you will return to me. They always do. Etta didn't look back as she walked away from the shack, Old Blue trotting faithfully beside her. But she could feel the entity's attention on her back like a physical weight, and she knew with absolute certainty that this encounter was far from over. The real question was, what was she going to do about it? The walk back to the slave quarters felt like emerging from a nightmare into the waking world. But Etta knew that what she had experienced was all too real. The humid Georgia air, which had felt oppressive before, now seemed almost refreshing after the suffocating atmosphere of the shack. Old Blue walked beside her, no longer agitated, but maintaining a watchful alertness, as if he expected the entity to somehow follow them. As they approached the familiar cluster of cabins, Etta could see the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Soon the overseer's horn would sound, calling the slaves to another day of backbreaking labor in the cotton fields. The routine of plantation life would resume, and she would be expected to take her place in it, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The knowledge of what lay in that abandoned shack, of the malevolent entity that had been bound there by her own ancestors, weighed on her like a physical burden. She felt as if she were carrying a terrible secret that could destroy everyone she cared about if it were ever revealed, or if she made the wrong choice about what to do with it. Etta. Child, where you been? The voice made her jump, and she turned to see Mama Sarah standing in the doorway of their cabin, her weathered face creased with worry. The older woman was already dressed for the day's work, her grey hair covered with a faded head wrap, her calloused hands clutching a worn shawl around her shoulders. I couldn't sleep, Etta said, which was true enough. Went for a walk to clear my head. Mama Sarah's sharp eyes took in Etta's appearance, the dirt on her feet, the way her dress was wrinkled from kneeling on the floor of the shack, the haunted expression she couldn't quite hide. But the older woman didn't press for details. On a plantation, everyone had secrets, and sometimes it was safer not to know them. Well, you best get yourself cleaned up, Mama Sarah said gently. Overseer Briggs been in a foul mood lately, and you don't want to give him any excuse to take it out on you. Etta nodded and slipped into the cabin where the other women were beginning to stir. She quickly washed her face and hands in the basin of water they shared, changed into her work dress, and tried to compose herself for the day ahead. But her mind kept returning to the entity's words, to the visions it had shown her, to the terrible choice it had offered. The overseer's horn sounded just as the sun crested the horizon, its harsh blast cutting through the morning air like a whip crack. All around the quarters, slaves emerged from their cabins, moving with the weary efficiency of people who had performed the same routine countless times before. Etta fell into line with the other field hands, her body going through the familiar motions, while her mind remained focused on the events of the night. She barely noticed the walk to the cotton fields, barely heard Overseer Briggs's usual morning threats and warnings. All she could think about was the entity's claim that her ancestors had faced the same choice she now faced, and that they had chosen to bind it rather than free it. But how? And more importantly, why hadn't anyone told her about it? As the day wore on, Etta found herself studying the faces of the older slaves, wondering which of them might know something about the shack and its dark secret. Mama Sarah was the obvious choice. She was old enough to remember stories from the early days of the plantation, and she had always seemed to know more about the spiritual world than she let on. But there were others too. Old Moses, who claimed to be nearly 90 and had been on the plantation longer than anyone else. Aunt Celia, who sometimes muttered in languages that sounded like they came from the old country. Even some of the middle-aged slaves might have heard stories passed down from their parents or grandparents. The problem was finding a way to ask without revealing what she had discovered. The entity had made it clear that it could influence people, could show them visions and whisper seductive lies. If word got out about what was in the shack, some desperate soul might be tempted to seek it out, to make the bargain that Etta had refused. By midday, the heat had become almost unbearable. The sun beat down mercilessly on the cotton fields, and even the slight breeze that had provided some relief during the morning had died away completely. Sweat poured down Etta's face as she moved between the rows of cotton plants, her fingers working automatically to pick the white bolls, while her mind wrestled with the problem of what to do next. It was during the brief rest period that Overseer Briggs allowed at noon that Etta finally found her opportunity. The slaves had gathered in whatever shade they could find, sharing water from communal buckets and trying to cool themselves before returning to work. Mama Sarah was sitting under a large oak tree, fanning herself with a piece of bark when Etta approached. "Mama Sarah," Etta said quietly, settling down beside the older woman, "can I ask you something?" "Course, child. What's on your mind?" Etta hesitated, trying to find the right words. "You know that old shack out past the quarters, the abandoned one?" Mama Sarah's hand stilled on her makeshift fan, and her eyes sharpened with sudden attention. "What about it?" "I was wondering, do you know why it was abandoned? What used to happen there?" For a long moment, Mama Sarah didn't answer. She stared out across the cotton fields, her expression unreadable, and Etta began to think she wasn't going to respond at all. But finally, the older woman spoke, her voice so low that Etta had to lean in to hear her. "That's not a place for young folks to be thinking about," she said. "That's a place with a dark history, child. Best to leave it be." "But what kind of history?" Etta pressed. "What happened there?" Mama Sarah turned to look at her directly, and Etta saw something in her eyes that made her stomach clench with unease. It was the same look she'd seen in Old Blue's clouded gaze, a mixture of knowledge and fear, of secrets that were too dangerous to share. "Why are you asking about that place?" Mama Sarah said. "You ain't been out there, have you?" Etta's hesitation was answer enough. Mama Sarah's eyes widened with alarm, and she grabbed Etta's wrist with surprising strength. "Child, tell me you didn't go inside that shack. Tell me you didn't touch nothing in there." "I didn't touch anything," Etta said quickly, which was technically true. "But I saw something wrapped in cloth." Mama Sarah's grip tightened, and her face went pale beneath her dark skin. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "It's starting again." "What's starting again? Mama Sarah, what do you know about that place?" The older woman looked around quickly, making sure no one else was close enough to overhear their conversation. Then she leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother told me stories," she said. "Stories about the early days of this plantation, when old Master Whitmore's daddy was still alive. He was a cruel man, child, crueler than his son could ever dream of being. And he was involved in things, dark things, things that no Christian soul should ever meddle with." "What kind of things?" "The kind that require blood and pain to work," Mama Sarah said grimly. the kind that call up spirits that should be left alone. My grandmother, she was just a girl then, but she remembered when slaves started disappearing. Not running away, disappearing. Gone without a trace, like they never existed at all. Etta's blood ran cold. What happened to them? Nobody knew for sure, but there were rumors. Stories about rituals being performed in that shack, about old Master Whitmore's daddy trying to bind spirits to his will. They say he wanted to create something that would keep the slaves in line, something that would make them too terrified to even think about rebellion. Did it work? Mama Sarah shook her head. Whatever he created, it got out of his control. The disappearances stopped, but not because he called off his experiments. They stopped because something went wrong, something that scared him so bad he abandoned the shack and never went near it again. And the thing he created? Still there, according to my grandmother, bound somehow, trapped but not destroyed. She said it would call to people sometimes, especially those with the sight, try to trick them into setting it free. Etta felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Everything Mama Sarah was telling her matched what the entity had shown her, what it had claimed about her ancestors. But there was still one crucial question that needed answering. Mama Sarah, she said carefully, did your grandmother ever say anything about certain families being connected to that place? About people who had the responsibility to keep whatever's in there from getting out? The older woman's eyes widened with understanding, and suddenly Etta knew that Mama Sarah had been waiting for this conversation for years, maybe decades. Your great-grandmother Kessie, Mama Sarah said slowly. She was the one who bound it, wasn't she? She was the one who stopped it from killing everyone on the plantation. Etta nodded, unable to speak. And now it's calling to you, Mama Sarah continued, because you got her blood, her gift, because it thinks you might be the one to finally set it free. How did you know? Because I've been watching for the signs, Mama Sarah said. My grandmother made me promise to watch, to be ready in case it ever started stirring again. She said there would be warnings, animals acting strange, people having nightmares, and eventually, someone from Kessie's bloodline would be drawn to that place. Old Blue, Etta said suddenly. He's been barking at the shack for 5 nights, that's what led me there. Mama Sarah nodded grimly. Animals can sense these things before people can. That dog's been trying to warn us. Warn us about what? What's going to happen? I don't know, child, but if that thing is stirring again after all these years, it means the bindings your great-grandmother put on it are weakening. And if they fail completely, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Etta could imagine all too well what would happen if the entity broke free. The visions it had shown her of its past victims were proof enough of its capabilities. What am I supposed to do? Etta asked desperately. How do I stop it? I don't know, Mama Sarah admitted. My grandmother never told me the details of how Kessie bound it in the first place. She said that knowledge was too dangerous to pass down unless it was absolutely necessary. Then how am I supposed to? There might be someone who knows, Mama Sarah interrupted. Someone who's been around even longer than me, who might remember things that others have forgotten. Who? Old Moses. He was here when it happened, child. He was just a boy, but he was here. If anyone knows the truth about what your great-grandmother did, it would be him. Etta felt a surge of hope. Old Moses was legendary among the slaves for his age and his memory. He claimed to remember events from 60 years ago, as clearly as if they had happened yesterday. If he had been present during the original binding, he might know how to reinforce it or repair it. But approaching him would be tricky. Old Moses was notoriously suspicious of anyone who asked too many questions, and he had a tendency to speak in riddles and parables that could be difficult to interpret. She would have to be careful about how she approached him, careful about what she revealed and what she kept hidden. The overseer's horn sounded again, calling the slaves back to work, and Etta knew their conversation was over for now. But as she rose to return to the cotton fields, Mama Sarah caught her arm one last time. Be careful, child, she said urgently. That thing in the shack, it's patient and it's clever. It'll try to convince you that freeing it is the right thing to do, that it's the only way to end the suffering on this plantation. But don't listen to it. Whatever it promises you, whatever it shows you, remember that it feeds on death and despair. It doesn't want to end suffering, it wants to cause more of it. Etta nodded, but as she walked back to her assigned row of cotton plants, she couldn't shake the memory of the entity's seductive whispers, of the visions it had shown her of justice and revenge. Part of her, a part she was ashamed to acknowledge, had been tempted by its offer. The idea of seeing Master Whitmore and Overseer Briggs face consequences for their cruelties was almost irresistible, but Mama Sarah was right. The entity didn't want justice. It wanted destruction. And if Etta was going to stop it, she needed to find old Moses and learn everything he knew about the original binding. The question was, would she be able to find him before the entity found a way to break free on its own? As if in response to her thoughts, a cold wind suddenly swept across the cotton fields, despite the blazing heat of the afternoon sun. The other slaves looked up in confusion, but Etta knew what it meant. The entity was growing stronger, and time was running out. Finding an opportunity to speak privately with old Moses proved more challenging than Etta had anticipated. The ancient slave was something of a legend on Whitmore Plantation, a man so old that even the oldest residents couldn't remember a time when he hadn't been there. Some claimed he was approaching his 100th birthday, though Moses himself insisted he had stopped counting years ago because time ain't nothing but a white man's invention anyway. Despite his advanced age, Moses still worked in the fields, though his tasks had been reduced to lighter duties like mending tools and sorting cotton. He moved slowly but steadily, his gnarled hands still capable of delicate work, his clouded eyes still sharp enough to spot problems that younger workers might miss. But it was his mind that truly set him apart. A repository of stories, songs, and memories that stretched back to the earliest days of the plantation. The problem was that Moses was rarely alone. He had become something of a father figure to the younger slaves, and they often gathered around him during rest periods to hear his stories or seek his advice. Even when he was working, there always seemed to be someone nearby, drawn by his quiet wisdom and gentle humor. For 3 days after her conversation with Mama Sarah, Etta watched and waited for her chance. She went about her daily routine, picking cotton, tending to the vegetable garden behind the quarters, helping with the cooking and cleaning, but part of her attention was always focused on Moses, looking for an opportunity to approach him without drawing unwanted attention. During those 3 days, she also became increasingly aware that something was changing on the plantation. It was nothing dramatic, nothing that the white folks would notice, but the slaves were beginning to sense it. Animals were acting strangely, chickens refusing to lay eggs, horses shying away from certain areas, even the plantation's cats avoiding the eastern section where the abandoned shack stood. More troubling were the dreams. Etta heard whispered conversations about nightmares that felt too real, about visions of dark figures moving through the quarters at night, about voices calling from empty spaces. Some of the children had started crying in their sleep, and even the adults were showing signs of strain. Dark circles under their eyes, nervous glances over their shoulders, a general atmosphere of unease that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Old Blue had stopped barking at the shack, but that wasn't necessarily a good sign. Instead, the dog had taken to following Etta everywhere, pressing close to her side as if he were trying to protect her from something only he could see. His behavior was so unusual that even the other slaves had begun to comment on it. "That dog's taken a powerful shine to you," observed Mary one evening as they prepared the communal dinner. "Acts like he thinks you're in some kind of danger." Etta forced a smile, scratching Old Blue behind the ears. "He's just getting old and clingy, probably misses Miss Caroline," but she knew it was more than that. Old Blue could sense the entity's growing influence, could feel the spiritual pressure that was building like a storm on the horizon. The dog was trying to warn her, trying to keep her safe, but there was only so much a mortal animal could do against supernatural forces. On the 4th day, Etta's patience was finally rewarded. She was working in the vegetable garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of beans and squash, when she noticed Moses sitting alone under a large pecan tree at the edge of the quarters. He was mending a broken hoe handle, his weathered fingers working with the kind of practiced skill that came from decades of experience. This was her chance. Etta glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then made her way over to where Moses sat. Old Blue followed, as he always did, but settled quietly at her feet when she sat down beside the old man. "Afternoon, Uncle Moses," she said, using the respectful title that all the younger slaves employed when addressing him. Moses looked up from his work, his clouded eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel as if he were looking directly into her soul. "Afternoon, child. You got something weighing on your mind, don't you?" Etta wasn't surprised that he had noticed. Moses had always been perceptive, able to read people's moods and intentions with uncanny accuracy. But his directness caught her off guard, and for a moment she struggled to find the right words. I wanted to ask you about something," she said finally. "Something that happened a long time ago." Moses set down the hoe handle and gave her his full attention. "How long ago we talking about, child?" "When you were young, when old Master Whitmore's father was still alive." The change in Moses's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His entire body went rigid, and his eyes, clouded though they were, seemed to focus on something far beyond the physical world. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "That's a dangerous time to be asking about, child. What you want to know about those days for?" Etta took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment of truth. She could try to be subtle, to approach the subject indirectly, but something in Moses's expression told her that he would see through any attempt at deception. This was a man who had lived through horrors that most people couldn't imagine, who had survived by learning to recognize truth from lies, safety from danger. "I found something," she said simply. "Something in the old shack past the quarters, and I think it's connected to my family somehow." Moses was quiet for so long that Etta began to wonder if he was going to respond at all. He stared off into the distance, his gnarled hands folded in his lap, his breathing slow and steady. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of carefully guarded secrets. "Your great-grandmother Casey," he said. "You got her look about you, child. Same eyes, same way of holding yourself. I wondered when one of her blood would come asking questions." "You knew her?" "Knew her?" Moses laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Child, I was there the night she saved us all. I was just a boy then, maybe 12 or 13 years old, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Remember the fear, the darkness, the things that walked in shadows and fed on pain." Etta's heart began to race. What happened? What did she do? Moses glanced around, making sure they were still alone, then leaned closer to Etta. "You sure you want to know this, child? Some knowledge is a burden, and once you carry it, you can't ever put it down." "I need to know," Etta said firmly. "Whatever's in that shack, it's getting stronger, I can feel it. And I think it's calling to me because of who I am, because of what my great-grandmother did." Moses nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. "Then I reckon it's time you heard the whole story. But you got to promise me something first. You don't repeat none of this to anyone else unless it's a matter of life and death. This knowledge has been kept secret for 40 years, and there's good reason for that, I promise." Moses settled back against the tree trunk, his eyes taking on the distant look of someone reaching deep into memory. "It started with the disappearances," he began. "Slaves going missing in the night, vanishing without a trace. At first, folks thought they were running away, trying to escape to the north. But then we started finding the bodies." Etta's blood ran cold. "Bodies? What was left of them?" Moses said grimly. "Drained dry, like something had sucked the very life out of them. No wounds, no signs of violence, but their eyes. Lord have mercy. Their eyes were empty, like looking into a well that goes down to hell itself." He paused, his hands trembling slightly as he relived the memories. "Old Master Whitmore's daddy, he was behind it all. Had himself a group of followers, people who believed in dark magic and blood rituals. They thought they could create something, a spirit, a demon, call it what you will, that would keep the slaves in line through pure terror." "The entity I saw," Etta whispered. "That's what they created." "Taz created, summoned, awakened. I ain't sure there's a difference," Moses replied. "But whatever it was, it got out of their control real quick. Started taking anyone it could get its hands on. Not just slaves, but white folks too. Even took one of old Master Whitmore's own children before it was done." "How many people died?" 17 that we know of," Moses said. "Probably more that we never found. It went on for 3 months, child. 3 months of pure terror, with people afraid to sleep, afraid to be alone, afraid to even step outside after dark." "And my great-grandmother stopped it?" Moses nodded. "Cassie was what you might call a root woman. Someone who knew the old ways, the spiritual practices that came from Africa. She could see things others couldn't, do things others couldn't. And when it became clear that nobody else was going to stop this thing, she took it upon herself to act." "How?" She gathered the other root women on the plantation. There were 4 of them in total, and they performed a binding ritual. I don't know all the details, child, because they kept it secret even from those of us who helped them. But I know it required sacrifice. Not just blood, but life force itself. They bound that thing with their own spiritual energy, wrapped it in cloth blessed with their tears and pain, tied it with knots that held more than just rope. Moses's voice grew heavy with sorrow. Your great-grandmother, she was the strongest of them, so she took on the biggest burden. The others, they gave what they could and survived. But Casey, she poured so much of herself into that binding that she was never the same afterward. What do you mean? She lived for another 10 years after that night, but she wasn't really living, if you understand me. Part of her spirit was tied to that thing, keeping it contained, making sure it couldn't break free. She aged 20 years in the space of 1, and toward the end, she spent most of her time just sitting and staring off into nothing, like she was watching something the rest of us couldn't see. Etta felt tears stinging her eyes. She was guarding it. Even after she died, she was still guarding it. That's what I always figured, Moses agreed. And now you're telling me it's stirring again, which means either the binding is weakening or something's trying to break it from the outside. Both, I think, Etta said. It told me that it's been calling to people from my family for generations, trying to find someone who would free it. And it's definitely getting stronger. I can feel it even from here. Moses was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face creased with worry. Child, I got to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Did that thing make you any offers? Did it try to convince you to set it free? Etta nodded reluctantly. It showed me visions of what it could do to Master Whitmore and Overseer Briggs. Said it could end all the suffering on the plantation. And were you tempted? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Etta wanted to lie, wanted to claim that she had never wavered in her resolve, but something in Moses's eyes told her that he would know if she wasn't being truthful. Yes, she admitted quietly. For a moment, I was tempted. The idea of seeing them pay for all the cruelty they've caused. It was appealing. Moses nodded, and to her surprise, there was no judgment in his expression, only understanding. That's how it works, child. It finds the thing you want most and promises to give it to you. But what it don't tell you is the price. That thing don't just kill people. It devours them body and soul, leaves nothing behind but empty shells walking around, going through the motions of life while it grows fat on their stolen essence. I know, Etta said. I could sense what it really was, underneath all the pretty promises. That's why I refused. Good, Moses said firmly. But refusing once ain't enough, child. That thing is patient, and it's clever. It'll keep trying, keep showing you reasons why you should change your mind. And every day that passes, it gets a little stronger, a little more persuasive. Then what am I supposed to do? How do I stop it? Moses was quiet for a long time, his gnarled fingers working absently at the broken hoe handle. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with reluctance. There might be a way, he said slowly. But it would require you to do something that goes against every instinct you have, something that could get you killed if you're not careful. What? You'd have to go back to that shack, Moses said, not just to look at the thing, but to actually touch it, to make contact with it on a spiritual level. Only then could you see the binding as it really is, understand how it works and what needs to be done to repair it. Etta's blood ran cold. But you just said it was dangerous, that it would try to corrupt me. It is dangerous, Moses confirmed, more dangerous than anything you've ever faced. But child, if that binding fails completely, everyone on this plantation is going to die, and it won't stop there. That thing will spread like a plague, consuming everything in its path, until there's nothing left but emptiness and despair. The weight of responsibility settled on Etta's shoulders like a physical burden. She thought of little Samuel, of Mary's baby, of all the innocent people who would suffer if the entity broke free. She thought of her great-grandmother, who had sacrificed so much to protect them, and of the generations of her family who had carried this burden in secret. If I do this, she said carefully, if I make contact with it, what exactly am I looking for? The weak points in the binding, Moses explained. Your great-grandmother and the other root women, they wove a complex spiritual net around that thing. Layer upon layer of protection and containment. But 40 years is a long time, child. Some of those layers have probably worn thin, and others might have developed cracks or gaps. And once I find the weak points, then you'd have to repair them, Moses said simply. Reinforce the binding with your own spiritual energy, just like your great-grandmother did. But that could kill me, couldn't it? You said she was never the same after the original binding. Moses nodded gravely. It could. Or it could just leave you like Casey was, alive but not really living, tied to that thing for the rest of your days. There's no way to know for sure until you try. Etta stared off across the cotton fields, watching the other slaves going about their daily routines, unaware of the supernatural threat that hung over them all. She thought about the choice her great-grandmother had made, the sacrifice she had willingly accepted to protect her people. Could Etta do any less? Is there anyone else who could do it? She asked. Anyone else with the right bloodline or abilities? Not that I know of, Moses said sadly. Your grandmother died young and your mother never showed signs of having the sight. Far as I can tell, you're the only one left with both the blood and the gift. Then I don't really have a choice, do I? There's always a choice, child, Moses said gently. But some choices are harder than others, and some burdens can only be carried by those strong enough to bear them. Old Blue, who had been lying quietly at Etta's feet, suddenly raised his head and whined softly. The dog's clouded eyes were fixed on something in the distance, and his body was tense with alertness. What is it, boy? Etta asked, following his gaze. At first she didn't see anything unusual, just the familiar landscape of the plantation, with its cotton fields and scattered buildings. But then she noticed it. A darkness that seemed to be spreading across the eastern horizon like storm clouds gathering despite the clear sky. Lord have mercy, Moses whispered, his face going pale. It's starting. What's starting? The final push, Moses said, struggling to his feet with obvious effort. That thing's done being patient, child. It's going to try to break free tonight, whether the binding's ready to fail or not. As if to confirm his words, a cold wind suddenly swept across the plantation, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something that made Etta's skin crawl with revulsion. In the distance she could hear dogs barking, horses whinnying in distress, and the confused voices of slaves wondering why the temperature had suddenly dropped 20 degrees. What do I do? Etta asked desperately. Moses gripped her shoulder with surprising strength. You go to that shack, child. You go now before it gets any stronger. And you do whatever it takes to hold that binding together, even if it costs you everything. But I don't know how... You'll know, Moses interrupted. The knowledge is in your blood passed down from your great-grandmother. When the time comes, you'll know what to do. The darkness on the horizon was spreading faster now, and Etta could feel something pressing against her mind, not the seductive whispers she had heard before, but something more urgent, more demanding. The entity was calling to her, and this time it wasn't taking no for an answer. Go, Moses urged, and may God protect you, child, because you're about to face something that would drive most folks mad just to look at it. Etta nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had known this moment would come, had felt it approaching like a storm on the horizon. Now there was no more time for preparation, no more time for doubt. She had to face her destiny, whatever the cost. The walk to the abandoned shack felt like moving through a nightmare made manifest. With each step, the world around Etta seemed to shift and distort, as if reality itself were becoming unstable. The familiar landscape of Whitmore Plantation, the cotton fields she had worked since childhood, the paths she had walked thousands of times, now felt alien and threatening. Old Blue trotted beside her, no longer the aging, gentle companion she had known, but a creature transformed by supernatural awareness. His clouded eyes now glowed with an inner light, and his movements had taken on an otherworldly grace that suggested he was seeing and responding to things beyond normal perception. The temperature continued to drop as they approached the shack, despite the fact that the sun was still high in the afternoon sky. Frost began to form on the grass beneath their feet, and Etta's breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. But it wasn't just the cold that made her shiver, it was the sense of wrongness that permeated everything. The feeling that the natural order of things was being twisted and corrupted by forces that should never have been unleashed. Behind them, she could hear the sounds of confusion and fear from the plantation. Slaves were calling out to each other, their voices carrying notes of panic as they tried to understand what was happening. Horses were screaming in their stables, and even the usually placid cattle were lowing in distress. It's affecting everything, Etta murmured. watching as a flock of birds suddenly changed direction in mid-flight, wheeling away from the eastern section of the plantation as if fleeing from some invisible predator. Old Blue whined in response, pressing closer to her side. The dog's presence was comforting, but Etta knew that whatever they were about to face, there was little he could do to protect her. This was a battle that would be fought on spiritual rather than physical ground. As they crested the small hill that overlooked the shack, Etta gasped in shock. The building was no longer the decrepit, abandoned structure she had visited just days before. Instead, it seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its walls rippling like water, its roof shifting between solid matter and something that looked more like congealed shadow. Around the shack, the very air seemed to writhe and twist, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. Etta could see shapes moving within those patterns, not quite human, but not entirely inhuman either. They were the spirits of the entity's victims, she realized, trapped in its web of hunger and despair, forced to serve as extensions of its will. "Dear God," she whispered, understanding for the first time the true scope of what her great-grandmother had faced 40 years ago. The entity's presence pressed against her mind with renewed force, no longer bothering with seduction or false promises. Its mental voice was a roar of rage and hunger that threatened to overwhelm her consciousness entirely. "You cannot stop me," it snarled. "The binding weakens with every passing moment. Soon I will be free, and when I am, I will make you watch as I devour everyone you have ever cared about." "I won't let that happen," Etta said aloud, though her voice shook with fear. "You are nothing," the entity replied, a child playing with forces beyond her comprehension. "Your great-grandmother was strong, but even she could not destroy me. What makes you think you can succeed where she failed?" But even as the entity spoke, Etta could feel something stirring within her, a warmth that seemed to emanate from her very bones, a power that felt both foreign and familiar. It was the gift that had been passed down through her bloodline, the spiritual strength that had allowed her ancestors to stand against darkness. She approached the shack slowly, Old Blue matching her pace step for step. The closer they got, the more intense the spiritual pressure became, until it felt like walking through molasses made of pure malevolence. But Etta pressed on, driven by the knowledge that failure would mean death for everyone she loved. The door of the shack hung open, revealing an interior that defied physical laws. The space inside seemed vast, stretching away into shadows that had no end, while simultaneously feeling cramped and claustrophobic. At the center of this impossible space, the bundle she had seen before was no longer wrapped in cloth. Instead, the entity had partially manifested, taking on a form that was a grotesque amalgamation of all its victims. It had too many arms, too many faces, too many eyes that burned with stolen life force. Parts of it were recognizably human, while others belonged to creatures that had never walked the earth. It was beautiful and hideous, seductive and repulsive, a contradiction made flesh that embodied the very concept of corruption. But it was the binding that truly captured Etta's attention. She could see it now with her enhanced spiritual sight, a complex web of energy that surrounded the entity like a cage made of light and will. The binding was indeed weakening, just as Moses had predicted. Entire sections had faded to barely visible threads, while others showed cracks and gaps that allowed the entity's influence to seep through. "Look upon your great-grandmother's work," the entity said, its multiple voices speaking in perfect unison. "See how it crumbles, how it fails. She thought she could contain me forever, but nothing lasts forever, child. Nothing except hunger." Etta stepped into the shack, feeling the spiritual pressure increase exponentially. The entity's presence was overwhelming, a weight that threatened to crush her consciousness and leave her as empty and hollow as its other victims. But she forced herself to focus on the binding, to study its structure and understand how it worked. What she saw filled her with both awe and despair. The binding was a masterwork of spiritual engineering, layer upon layer of protection and containment, woven together with a skill that spoke of decades of study and practice. Her great-grandmother and the other root women had created something that was part prison, part seal, and part ongoing ritual, designed to contain an entity that existed partially outside normal reality. But 40 years of constant pressure had taken their toll. The binding was failing not because it was poorly made, but because it had been asked to do the impossible, to contain something that grew stronger with each passing day, while the power that maintained it remained static. You see the truth now, the entity said, its tone almost gentle. The binding cannot be repaired, it can only be replaced. And to create a new binding would require the same sacrifice your great-grandmother made, your life, your soul, your very essence, poured into the spiritual matrix that holds me. There has to be another way, Etta said desperately. There is, the entity replied. Free me. Allow me to complete my purpose, to end the suffering on this plantation, once and for all. I promise you, their deaths will be quick and painless. They will know peace at last. Images flashed through Etta's mind, visions of the plantation's slaves lying peacefully in their beds, their faces serene, their suffering finally ended. It was a tempting vision, especially when contrasted with the alternative, watching everyone she loved die slowly and horribly as the entity fed on their terror and despair. But then she remembered Moses's words about the empty shells the entity left behind, about the true nature of the peace it offered. This wasn't mercy, it was consumption disguised as kindness. No, she said firmly, I won't let you hurt them. The entity's rage was immediate and terrible. The shack shook around them and the temperature dropped even further. Ice began to form on the walls, and the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent energy. Then you will die, it snarled. And after you are gone, I will break free anyway. Your sacrifice will be meaningless. But even as the entity spoke, Etta was studying the binding more closely, looking for patterns and connections that might suggest a different solution. Her great-grandmother had been working with the knowledge and resources available 40 years ago, but perhaps there was something she had missed, some approach that hadn't been considered. And then she saw it, a section of the binding that was different from the rest, more complex and layered. It was the anchor point, the place where the spiritual energy that maintained the entire structure was focused. If she could reinforce that single point, strengthen it with her own power, it might be enough to stabilize the entire binding. It would still require sacrifice. She could see that clearly. The anchor point was designed to be maintained by a living consciousness, someone who could continuously feed their spiritual energy into the matrix. But it wouldn't necessarily require her death, just her commitment to serve as a guardian for as long as the binding held. You think you have found a solution, the entity said, its multiple voices filled with amusement, but you understand nothing. That anchor point was designed for your great-grandmother specifically, attuned to her spiritual signature. You cannot simply step into her role. Maybe not, Etta admitted, but I can try. She reached out with her spiritual senses, trying to touch the anchor point and understand its structure. The moment she made contact, pain shot through her like lightning, and she could feel the entity's presence pressing against her mind with renewed force. You see? It said triumphantly. You are not strong enough. You do not have the knowledge. You will fail just as all the others have failed. But Etta didn't pull back. Instead, she pressed deeper into the connection, allowing her consciousness to merge with the binding itself. The pain was excruciating, like having her soul torn apart and reassembled, but she endured it, driven by the knowledge that this might be her only chance. And then, suddenly, she wasn't alone. Granddaughter. The voice was warm and familiar, filled with love and pride and infinite sadness. Etta could feel her great-grandmother's presence surrounding her, supporting her, guiding her through the complex spiritual matrix that held the entity. Casey, Etta called out with her mind. I have been waiting for you, her great-grandmother replied. Waiting and watching and hoping that someone from our bloodline would be strong enough to take up the burden. I don't know how, Etta admitted. I don't have your knowledge, your training. You have something more important, Casey said gently. You have the will to sacrifice yourself for others, the strength to stand against darkness even when it seems hopeless. That is all any of us can do, child. Stand against the darkness and hope that our light is enough. Around them the entity raged and thrashed, sensing that something was changing, that its moment of freedom was slipping away. But its struggles only seemed to strengthen the connection between Etta and her great-grandmother, as if their shared purpose was more powerful than its hunger. Show me what to do, Etta said. The binding must be renewed, Casey explained. Not repaired, but completely rebuilt with fresh power and purpose. It will require everything you have, child. Your life force, your memories, your very identity. You will become the guardian, as I have been, watching over this thing for as long as it takes. How long? Until someone stronger comes along, Casey said sadly. or until the world changes enough that such guardians are no longer needed. I cannot tell you how long that might be. Etta thought of the life she would be giving up, the chance to marry, to have children, to grow old surrounded by family and friends. She thought of all the experiences she would never have, all the joys and sorrows that would pass her by while she stood eternal watch over a creature of pure malevolence. But then she thought of little Samuel, of Mary's baby, of all the innocent people who would die if she failed. She thought of the future that Moses had hinted at, the changes that were coming that might bring freedom to her people. She thought of the generations yet to be born who would live and love and hope because she had chosen to stand guard. "I understand," she said finally. "I'm ready." "Then let us begin," Casey said, "and may God forgive us both for what we are about to do." The ritual began with a sensation that Etta could only describe as coming apart at the seams. Every fiber of her being, physical, mental, and spiritual, seemed to unravel simultaneously, as if she were being deconstructed at the most fundamental level. But even as she felt herself dissolving, she could sense her great-grandmother's presence guiding the process, ensuring that the essential core of who she was remained intact. "Do not fight it," Casey's voice whispered in her mind. "Let yourself become part of the binding. Let your essence flow into the spiritual matrix that holds the darkness." Around them, the entity's struggles grew more frantic as it realized what was happening. The shack shook violently, and the temperature plummeted to levels that should have been impossible in the Georgia heat. Ice formed on every surface, and the very air seemed to crystallize with malevolent energy. "You cannot do this," the entity roared, its multiple voices creating a cacophony of rage and desperation. "I will not be bound again. I will not return to that prison of shadows and silence." But its protests were futile. The new binding was already taking shape, woven from Etta's life force, and guided by Casey's accumulated knowledge. It was different from the original, stronger in some ways, more flexible in others, designed to adapt and evolve as circumstances changed. Etta could feel her memories beginning to fade, not disappearing entirely but becoming distant and dreamlike. Her childhood in the slave quarters, her friendships with the other young women, her hopes and fears and dreams, all of it was being absorbed into the binding, becoming part of the spiritual structure that would contain the entity. "Will I remember who I was?" she asked her great-grandmother. "For a time," Casey replied sadly. "But the years will blur together, and the memories of your mortal life will become like half-remembered dreams. It is the price of the binding. To hold something so alien and malevolent, you must become somewhat alien yourself. And you? Will you finally be able to rest? Yes, child, my watch is ending and yours is beginning. I will fade into whatever comes after, knowing that the burden has been passed to capable hands." The entity made one final desperate attempt to break free, pouring all of its accumulated power into a single overwhelming assault on the forming binding. For a moment, Etta thought it might succeed. The spiritual matrix wavered and threatened to collapse under the onslaught. But then Old Blue was there, his consciousness somehow joining with theirs, adding his simple but pure devotion to the mix. The dog's loyalty, his unwavering commitment to protecting those he loved, became another thread in the binding, strengthening it in ways that raw power alone could not. "Even the animals understand," Casey observed, with something that might have been amusement. "This dog has chosen to share your burden, to stand watch alongside you." The entity's assault faltered and failed, its power turned back on itself by the combined will of three souls united in purpose. With a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind, it collapsed back into the center of the binding, once again contained, but now held by bonds that were stronger and more resilient than anything that had come before. "It is done," Casey said, her voice already beginning to fade. "The binding is complete, and the entity is contained. But remember, child, this is not a victory, merely a postponement. The thing we guard is patient and clever, and it will never stop trying to escape." "I understand," Etta replied, though her own voice sounded strange and distant to her ears. "Be strong, granddaughter, be vigilant. And remember that sometimes the greatest courage is simply enduring, day after day, year after year, standing guard against the darkness, so that others may live in the light." With those words, Casey's presence faded entirely, leaving Etta alone with Old Blue and the contained entity. The shack had returned to its normal appearance, though she could see it now with enhanced spiritual sight, not just as a physical structure, but as a nexus point where multiple realities intersected. The binding was invisible to normal perception, but to Etta it blazed like a star, a complex web of energy and intention that surrounded the entity like a cage made of crystallized will. She could feel its weight, its constant pressure, the way it drew on her life force to maintain its integrity. She was no longer entirely human, she realized. The ritual had changed her at a fundamental level, making her something between mortal and spirit, alive but not truly living. She would not age, would not die in any conventional sense, but she would also never again experience the simple joys of human existence. "This is what you chose," the entity said, its voice now muffled and distant but still audible. "An eternity of loneliness, watching over something that will never stop trying to destroy you. Was it worth it?" Etta looked out through the shack's doorway, across the cotton fields to where the slave quarters stood. Even from this distance, she could see people moving about, going about their daily routines, unaware of how close they had come to annihilation. Children played in the dirt between the cabins, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Adults tended to their small gardens and mended their clothes, finding moments of peace and contentment despite the harsh circumstances of their lives. "Yes," she said simply, "it was worth it." The entity's laughter was bitter and mocking. "We shall see, Guardian. We shall see how long your resolve lasts when the years stretch into decades, when everyone you ever knew is dead and gone, when you are nothing but a memory of a memory, forgotten by the very people you died to protect." But Etta had already turned away, focusing instead on the binding and the constant vigilance it required. She could feel the entity testing the barriers, probing for weaknesses, never resting in its efforts to escape. It would be her job to counter those efforts, to reinforce the binding whenever it showed signs of strain, to stand eternal watch over a creature that embodied humanity's darkest impulses. Old Blue settled beside her, his warm presence a comfort in the growing darkness. The dog had been changed by the ritual as well, she realized. His clouded eyes now held depths of understanding that spoke of enhanced awareness, and his simple devotion had been transformed into something approaching wisdom. "Just you and me now, old boy," she said, scratching behind his ears. "Think you're up for a long watch?" Old Blue's tail thumped once against the floor, and Etta could swear she saw understanding in his gaze. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they would face in the years ahead, they would face them together. Outside, the sun was setting over Whitmore Plantation, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was beautiful, Etta thought, even knowing that she would see thousands of such sunsets in the years to come, each one marking another day of successful vigilance, another day that the darkness had been held at bay. The entity pulsed in its binding, testing her resolve, but Etta's will remained firm. She had made her choice, accepted her burden, and she would carry it for as long as necessary. The watch had begun. 5 years later, the seasons had blurred together into an endless cycle of watching and waiting. Etta had witnessed 5 springs bloom across the plantation, 5 summers scorch the cotton fields, 5 autumns paint the leaves in brilliant colors, and 5 winters coat the ground with frost. But for her, time had taken on a different quality, not the linear progression that mortals experienced, but something more fluid, more cyclical, marked not by days and months, but by the constant ebb and flow of spiritual energy. The Civil War had come and gone, just as she had sensed it would during those final days of her mortality. She had watched from her spiritual vantage point as Union soldiers marched through the plantation gates, as the slaves were declared free, as the old order crumbled and a new one struggled to be born. Master Whitmore had fled north with what wealth he could carry, leaving the plantation to fall into decay and abandonment. But Etta remained, as she always would, standing guard over the entity that pulsed with malevolent patience in its spiritual prison. The freed slaves had scattered to the winds, seeking new lives and opportunities in a world that was still hostile to their aspirations, but no longer legally bound them in chains. Some had stayed in the area, working as sharecroppers on land they had once tended as slaves. Others had headed north or west, chasing dreams of true freedom and equality. Mama Sarah had been among those who stayed, establishing a small cabin near the old quarters and serving as a midwife and healer for the scattered community that remained. She was one of the few who could still see Etta, though their conversations had become increasingly rare as the years passed, and Etta's connection to the mortal world continued to fade. "You're looking more like a spirit every time I see you, child," Mama Sarah had observed during their last meeting, her own face now deeply lined with age and hardship. "Sometimes I wonder if you're still really there, or if I'm just talking to a memory." Etta had wanted to reassure her, to prove that she was still present and aware, but the truth was that she wasn't entirely sure herself. The boundary between her consciousness and the binding had become increasingly blurred, until sometimes she felt more like a function of the spiritual matrix than a person maintaining it. Old Blue had remained her constant companion throughout the years, his presence an anchor to whatever humanity she retained. The dog had been changed by the ritual in ways that defied natural law. He showed no signs of aging. His fur remained the same patchy brown and grey it had been on that first night, and his clouded eyes continued to hold depths of understanding that seemed almost human. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him one evening as they sat together in the shack, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson. "Do you ever wish you could have lived a normal dog's life, chasing rabbits and sleeping in the sun?" Old Blue looked at her with those wise, clouded eyes and thumped his tail once against the floor. It was the same gesture he had made that first night, and Etta chose to interpret it as contentment, as acceptance of the path they had chosen together. The entity had not been idle during these years. It had tested the binding constantly, probing for weaknesses, trying new approaches to corruption and escape. Sometimes it would be silent for months at a time, lulling Etta into a false sense of security before launching a sudden, overwhelming assault on the spiritual barriers that contained it. Other times it would whisper constantly, filling her mind with visions of the world beyond the plantation, showing her the struggles and sufferings of the freed slaves as they tried to build new lives in a society that still viewed them as less than human. "Look at them," it would say during these sessions. "Look how they suffer still. Poverty, discrimination, violence, freedom has brought them new forms of pain. Wouldn't it be kinder to end their struggles once and for all?" But Etta had learned to recognize these arguments for what they were, sophisticated lies designed to erode her resolve. She had seen enough through her enhanced spiritual awareness to know that despite the hardships, despite the setbacks and disappointments, the freed slaves were building something new and precious. They were creating families, establishing schools, founding churches, slowly but steadily claiming their place in the world. It was messy and imperfect and often heartbreaking, but it was also beautiful in its own way. It was life in all its complexity, with all its potential for both joy and sorrow, hope and despair, and that was something worth protecting, even at the cost of her own existence. 10 years later, the plantation had been sold to a northern businessman who planned to convert it into a lumber operation. Workers had come to tear down the old buildings and clear the land, but they had avoided the eastern section where the shack stood. Etta wasn't sure if this was due to some lingering spiritual influence or simply because the area was considered too remote and overgrown to be worth the effort. Either way, she was grateful for the solitude. The presence of large numbers of people made it harder to maintain the binding, their emotions and life forces creating interference that the entity could exploit. It was easier to focus when there were fewer distractions, fewer potential victims for the creature to fixate on. She had learned much about the nature of the binding during these years, understanding its structure and function in ways that even her great-grandmother might not have fully grasped. It was not simply a prison, she realized, but a complex spiritual ecosystem that required constant maintenance and adjustment. The entity was not static. It grew and changed over time, adapting to its confinement, developing new abilities and strategies. The binding had to evolve as well, becoming more sophisticated and resilient with each passing year. It was like tending a garden, Etta thought, except that the garden was made of crystallized will, and the weeds were manifestations of pure malevolence. Old Blue had become her partner in this work, his simple but pure devotion serving as a stabilizing force within the spiritual matrix. The dog seemed to understand the binding's needs instinctively, often alerting Etta to problems before she became aware of them herself. "You're getting better at this than I am," she told him one day as he guided her attention to a section of the binding that was showing signs of strain. "Maybe I should let you take over, and I'll be the faithful companion." Old Blue's tail wagged at the suggestion, but his eyes remained serious and focused. He understood the gravity of their situation, the constant vigilance required to keep the entity contained. There was no room for complacency, no moment when they could truly relax their guard. 25 years later, the world beyond the plantation had changed dramatically. Etta could sense it through the spiritual currents that flowed around and through the binding. New technologies, new ideas, new forms of human connection and conflict. The 19th century was giving way to the 20th, and with it came possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. But some things remained constant. Human nature, with all its capacity for both nobility and cruelty, continued to provide the entity with ammunition for its psychological attacks. Wars, injustices, tragedies. All of these fed into its arguments about the futility of existence, the pointlessness of suffering, the mercy that could be found in oblivion. Look at them, it would say, showing her visions of conflict and hardship from around the world. Look how they hurt each other, how they create new forms of suffering with each passing generation. What is the point of protecting such creatures? What value is there in preserving a species that seems determined to destroy itself? Because they also create beauty, Etta would reply, as she always did. Because they love and hope and dream. Because they're capable of growth and change and redemption. Pretty words, the entity would respond. But where is the evidence? Where is the proof that humanity is worth preserving? And Etta would show it what she had seen through her enhanced awareness. Acts of kindness and courage, moments of connection and understanding, the slow but steady progress toward a more just and compassionate world. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't fast, but it was real. The entity would fall silent then, unable to argue with the evidence of human potential. But Etta knew it was simply regrouping, preparing new arguments, new approaches to corruption. It was patient and clever and utterly relentless, and it would never stop trying to escape. 50 years later, Old Blue was gone. The dog had simply faded away one morning, his consciousness dissolving back into the spiritual matrix that had sustained him for so long. There had been no pain, no struggle, just a gentle transition from presence to absence, like a candle flame being extinguished by a soft breeze. Etta had felt his passing like a physical wound, a tearing in the fabric of her existence that left her more alone than she had ever been. For 50 years, Old Blue had been her constant companion, her anchor to whatever remained of her humanity. Without him, she felt herself drifting further into the realm of pure spirit, becoming more function than person. But the binding still required maintenance, and the entity still needed watching. So she continued her vigil, drawing strength from the memory of Old Blue's devotion, from the knowledge that his sacrifice had not been in vain. "You are alone now," the entity observed, its voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Your faithful companion has abandoned you, just as everyone else will eventually abandon you. How long before you realize the futility of your task? How long before you accept that oblivion is preferable to eternal solitude?" "I'm not alone," Etta replied, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I carry the memory of everyone I've protected, everyone who lived because I chose to stand guard." "Memories," the entity scoffed, "shadows of shadows, growing fainter with each passing year. Soon you will forget why you chose this path, forget the faces of those you died to protect. And when that happens, when you are nothing but an empty shell, maintaining a binding you no longer understand, what will be the point of continuing?" The question haunted Etta in the years that followed. She could feel her memories of mortal life continuing to fade, becoming more like half-remembered dreams than actual experiences. Sometimes she would try to recall her mother's face or the sound of Mama Sarah's laughter, only to find that the details had become blurred and indistinct. But she also discovered something unexpected. As her personal memories faded, her connection to the broader spiritual realm deepened. She began to perceive patterns and connections that spanned decades and centuries, to understand her role not just as a guardian of this particular entity, but as part of a larger cosmic balance between order and chaos, creation and destruction. 100 years later, the plantation was long gone, replaced by a small town that had grown up around a railroad junction. The shack still stood, though it was now hidden deep within a patch of woods that the townspeople avoided, without quite knowing why. Local legends had grown up around the area, stories of strange lights and unexplained sounds, of people who ventured too deep into the woods and returned changed, if they returned at all. Etta had become something of a local ghost story herself, though the details had been distorted by decades of retelling. Some said she was the spirit of a slave who had died protecting her children from their master's cruelty. Others claimed she was a witch who had made a bargain with dark forces and was now trapped by her own magic. None of them knew the truth, and Etta preferred it that way. The less attention the area attracted, the easier it was to maintain the binding without interference. She had visitors occasionally, people with some degree of spiritual sensitivity, who were drawn to the area by forces they didn't understand. Most of them fled when they sensed the true nature of what was contained there, but a few stayed long enough to offer their help. There was a young woman named Clara who claimed to be descended from one of the other root women who had helped with the original binding. She brought offerings of herbs and blessed objects, and her presence seemed to strengthen the spiritual matrix in small but meaningful ways. There was an old man named Thomas who said he was a student of what he called the hidden arts. He spent hours studying the binding with instruments that Etta didn't recognize, making notes in a language that seemed to shift and change even as she watched. And there was a child, a boy of perhaps 10 or 11, who appeared one day without explanation and simply sat quietly in the shack for several hours before disappearing just as mysteriously. But in those few hours, Etta felt more peace than she had experienced in decades, as if the child's innocent presence had somehow purified the spiritual atmosphere. They come and go, the entity observed. These seekers and scholars and lost souls, but none of them stay. None of them truly understand what you have sacrificed. In the end, you are still alone. No, Etta said, and for the first time in years, her voice carried conviction. I'm part of something larger, part of a tradition that stretches back through generations, part of a network of guardians and protectors who stand watch against the darkness. I may be alone in this place, but I'm not alone in this purpose. The entity fell silent, and Etta sensed that her words had struck home in some way. For all its power and malevolence, it was ultimately a creature of isolation and despair. The idea that she might be connected to something greater, something that transcended individual existence, was perhaps the one thing it truly couldn't understand or corrupt. Present day. The world had changed beyond recognition since Etta first took up her vigil. The small town had grown into a modest city, complete with shopping centers and suburban developments that crept ever closer to the woods where the shack stood. Technology had advanced to levels that would have seemed like magic to the slaves of Whitmore Plantation, and humanity had achieved things that previous generations could never have imagined. But the fundamental struggle between light and darkness, hope and despair, creation and destruction, remained unchanged. The entity in its binding was still as malevolent as ever, still testing the barriers that contained it, still whispering seductive lies about the mercy of oblivion. And Etta was still there, standing guard, maintaining the binding with a will that had been tempered by more than a century of vigilance. She was no longer recognizably human in any conventional sense, more spirit than flesh, more function than personality, but she retained the essential core of what had made her choose this path in the first place. The love for others that had driven her to sacrifice her mortal life had evolved into something broader and more universal, a commitment to the principle that existence, with all its flaws and suffering, was preferable to the void. That consciousness, with all its capacity for both cruelty and compassion, was worth preserving. That hope, however fragile and fleeting, was worth protecting. On quiet nights, when the spiritual pressure was low and the entity was dormant, Etta would sometimes sense the presence of others like herself, guardians standing watch over their own dark charges, protectors maintaining barriers against forces that would consume everything if given the chance. She couldn't communicate with them directly, but she could feel their determination, their shared commitment to holding the line against chaos. And sometimes, very rarely, she would sense something else, a presence that felt familiar, warm, and infinitely patient. Old Blue, perhaps, or her great-grandmother Casey, or simply the accumulated spirits of all those who had chosen to stand against the darkness throughout history. You are not forgotten, these presences seem to say. Your sacrifice is not meaningless. The watch continues, and it will continue long after you are gone. The entity stirred in its binding, testing the barriers as it did every day, every hour, every moment. But the barriers held, as they had held for more than a century, as they would continue to hold for as long as Etta maintained her vigil. "Another day," she said quietly, settling back into her eternal watch. "Another day that the darkness is held at bay." And in the distance, carried on the evening breeze, she could swear she heard the sound of a dog barking. Not in fear or warning, but in simple, faithful acknowledgement that the watch continued, that the light endured, that hope survived. The entity pulsed in its binding, patient and malevolent and utterly contained, and Etta smiled, knowing that tomorrow she would be here again, standing guard, holding the line, protecting a world that would never know her name or understand her sacrifice. It was enough. It had always been enough. The watch continued. Epilogue. The legend lives on present day, 150 years after the binding. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a folklore researcher from the nearby university, carefully made her way through the dense woods that surrounded what local legends called the Haunted Shack. She was working on a dissertation about Southern ghost stories and their historical origins, and this particular tale had caught her attention because of its unusual consistency across multiple generations of storytellers. Unlike most ghost stories, which tended to change and evolve with each telling, the legend of the slave woman who guarded something dark in the abandoned shack had remained remarkably stable for over a century. The details were always the same: a young woman named Etta who had sacrificed herself to protect others, a faithful dog who had stood by her side, and a presence that still watched over the area, keeping some unnamed evil at bay. What made the story even more intriguing was the fact that people still reported encounters with this guardian spirit, not the usual vague sightings or unexplained sounds that characterized most ghost stories, but detailed, consistent descriptions of a young African-American woman who appeared to those in distress, offering comfort and protection before vanishing without a trace. As Dr. Mitchell approached the clearing where the shack supposedly stood, she felt a sudden chill despite the warm afternoon air. The woods around her had grown unnaturally quiet, as if every bird and insect had suddenly decided to hold its breath. And then she saw it, a small, weathered building that looked far older than it should have, given the climate and the passage of time. It stood in a circle of dead grass surrounded by trees that leaned away from it as if blown by some invisible wind. Dr. Mitchell approached cautiously, her academic skepticism warring with a growing sense of unease. As she drew closer, she could see that the shack was not entirely abandoned. There were signs of recent maintenance, as if someone had been caring for it, despite its apparent age and isolation. "Hello?" she called out, feeling somewhat foolish but unable to shake the sensation that she was being watched. "Is anyone there?" For a moment there was only silence. Then, so faintly that she almost missed it, she heard a voice, young, female, tinged with an accent that spoke of the antebellum South. "You shouldn't be here, child. This isn't a place for the living." Dr. Mitchell spun around but saw no one. The voice had seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, carried on a breeze that she couldn't feel. "I'm a researcher," she said, addressing the empty air. "I'm studying the local legends. I don't mean any harm." "I know who you are, Sarah Mitchell," the voice replied. "And this time, Dr." Mitchell could see a faint shimmer in the air near the shack's doorway, as if heat waves were rising from invisible fire. "I know why you've come. But some stories are not meant to be told. Some truths are too dangerous to reveal." "What truth?" Dr. Mitchell asked, her scholarly curiosity overriding her fear. "What really happened here?" The shimmer in the air grew more distinct, and for a moment, Dr. Mitchell could swear she saw the outline of a young woman, her face kind, but infinitely sad. "A choice was made," the figure said. "A sacrifice was offered, and the darkness was held at bay. That is all you need to know. But the historical record will show you nothing of value," the figure interrupted. "Some battles are fought in shadows. Some victories are won in silence. The world is safer because of what happened here, but it is not a story that can be shared without consequences. Doctor." Mitchell felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave, to forget about her research and never return to this place, but she forced herself to stand her ground, driven by the same academic determination that had brought her here in the first place. "At least tell me your name," she said. "Let me honor your memory properly." The figure was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, Her voice was filled with a sadness that seemed to encompass centuries of loneliness and sacrifice. "I am Etta Washington," she said finally. "I was born a slave and I died free. I chose to stand guard against something that would have destroyed everything I loved, and I have maintained that watch for more than a century. That is my story, and it is the only story that matters." "What are you guarding against?" Dr. Mitchell asked. But the figure was already fading, becoming nothing more than a trick of light and shadow. "Go home, child," Etta's voice whispered on the wind. "Write your dissertation about other ghosts, other legends. Let this one rest in peace." Dr. Mitchell found herself walking away from the shack without consciously deciding to do so, her feet carrying her back through the woods toward her car. It wasn't until she was halfway back to the university that she realized she had no clear memory of what had happened in the clearing, only a vague sense that she had encountered something profound and terrible and beautiful all at once. She never returned to the woods, and her dissertation focused on other, safer legends, but sometimes late at night when she was alone in her office, she would remember fragments of that encounter, a voice filled with infinite sadness, a presence that radiated both strength and sorrow, and the absolute certainty that somewhere in those woods, someone was standing eternal watch against the darkness. And in the shack that existed between worlds, Etta Washington continued her vigil, as she had for more than a century, as she would for centuries to come. The entity in its binding pulsed with patient malevolence, testing the barriers that contained it, whispering seductive lies about the mercy of oblivion. But the barriers held, maintained by a will that had been tempered by decades of sacrifice and service. And in the spiritual realm that surrounded the physical world, other guardians stood their own watches, protecting humanity from threats it would never know existed. The darkness was held at bay, the light endured, the watch continued. And somewhere in the distance, carried on winds that touched both the world of the living and the realm of spirits, the sound of a faithful dog's bark echoed through eternity, a reminder that love and loyalty could transcend death itself, that some bonds were stronger than time, and that even in the deepest darkness hope could still be found.